I think we're here.
Okay, so hi everyone. We're here with Karen Sanders, the author of Bodies in the Bog and the Archaeological Imagination. So we're going to be talking imagination and bog bodies. Maybe you could just start with giving us a quick who you are, what you're up to.
Okay. My name is Karen Sanders. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley in the Scandinavian department, and my area of research is mostly Nordic Scandinavian literature and culture, with Danish as my major area. I'm originally from Copenhagen, and I'm interested in mostly the 19th century Romanticism, but also modern art. But throughout the years, I've also had a deep fascination with archaeology, and the book that I wrote came out of a fascination with the kind of interesting coming together of this understanding of a very deep and hidden past with modernity, with how we imagine the lives of the past to have been as we see them today. So Nordic literatures, but with this little side interest in archaeology. I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a literary scholar. Yeah.
Nice. So maybe we can start as well with just a little bit of an explanation about what bog bodies are for people who don't know of bog bodies.
Right. So, you know, bog bodies are sort of what they're saying. They're bodies that come from the bog because of the special properties that the bogs have, the kind of acidity that they have. They have this kind of liminal quality. They're neither land nor water. They're sort of liminal spaces, paradoxical spaces that if you disappear into them by accident or purpose, you will die. But they also then preserve you, which is kind of a paradox, you know, that the very death that you have is also a kind of preservation of you. Not of everyone that ends up in the bog, but of some. Bodies that are then mummified naturally in the bogs, and then throughout time have resurfaced and then been interpreted whenever they came up through the centuries in a variety of different ways. So a bog body is a mummified human body that has, for whatever reason, ended up in the bog and been preserved there. And then comes up as a kind of what I, in the book, propose a kind of three-dimensional photography from the past.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a really nice description.
Yeah, it's nice because when we first came across bogs and peatlands, we were also struck by this kind of nature of it being not quite land, not quite water, not quite dead, not quite alive. So it's really interesting also seeing that reflected, yeah, not just in the bog, but in the bog bodies as well. And maybe we can also just talk a little bit about the other part of the title, this archaeological imagination, and what this refers to.
Right. So in cultural studies for many years, there's been an interest in historical imagination, in ethnographic imagination, geographic imagination, and so on and so forth. And by putting sort of archaeological imagination or archaeology in front of imagination, what I mean by that is that what archaeology is specifically interested in these kind of different layers of time, that you're digging through layers of time. So the archaeological imagination is a way in which you try to engage an imaginary, which could be in terms of fiction, or it could be in terms of photography, or it could be visual art, or even museum displays, in which you try to think archaeology in a conflation with fictionality. So this imaginary way in which we go to the past and say, well, there are many things we do not know, but let's propose, you know, let's think of this as a possibility. So for example, the bog bodies have come to stand in for us as human beings for all kinds of different atrocities. They've been seen as Holocaust survivors, for example. They've also been eroticized, you know, seen as sort of like that malleability and wetness of the bog has sort of erotic qualities that has rubbed off on some of the interpretations that the bog bodies have been submitted to. They have also been seen as sort of these amazing survivors of a past, like eyewitness to a past that we can't know, and so on and so forth. So the kind of archaeological imagination I'm looking at is not archaeology proper, but rather how that way of going through layers of time and the materiality of that, that kind of lifts new stories up, that is very much resonant with the moment that the bog bodies resurface. So one of the points that I have in the book is that, and what I found out very early on was, I sort of first imagined that I would write something that would be very chronological. So you have sort of this layer, then that layer, then this, and we would dig down, you know, in time or from time further up. And I soon realized that that was just not a viable model for something like the bogs, because the bogs are so entropic, they're so sort of liminal, they're so hard to deal with in that kind of chronological fashion. So, so instead I looked at the moments when a particular bog body, some bog body that would generate a cultural afterlife, when they erupted out of the bog, I would make that into sort of a point of interest. And so say, well, what happened here? So if a bog body is found in 1836, it's a very different story that you get than if the bog body is found in 2009, right? You know, because we know things differently and we interpret it differently. So if it comes up during a time when you still believe that you know, this might have been a murder or a suicide, you know, you hurry up and rebury it or bury it in Christian ground or whatever to undo the find. If it comes up after the Second World War, for example, it could be seen like a messenger from a past that are speaking to some of the atrocities that happened during the Second World War, and so on and so forth. And so
then it's more of a reflection or interpretation on those current circumstances as opposed to the ones that body actually went through.
Exactly. So I basically felt like I had to leave to the archaeologist to say what we know and what science can tell us about the archaeological remains, and what the geologists can say about the peat and the bogs and so forth. As a literary scholar and a cultural scholar, I can see what the cultural afterlife of the production that comes out about what can they bring to bear, what can they comment on, and why do they do it? What is it that's so interesting? And I had originally just thought that I would write an article because I used to teach Seamus Heaney's poem on the Danish tongue land that I grew up with. And I thought I would write an article on that. And then when I started digging into the material, I thought, oh, somebody else wrote about this, and oh, somebody else did this. And before I knew it, my archive was bigger than I could actually fit into the book. And that was a big surprise to me, that there was so much material to be found.
Yeah, I saw as well that you wrote about Margaret Atwood, having written something about her, and I haven't checked it out yet, but I thought that would also be very interesting. Her interpretation of the bog bodies as well.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Seamus Heaney, the Irish Nobel Prize poet, was very important to me because he sort of reintroduced me to something that I had been interested in when I grew up in Copenhagen, where the bog bodies became very famous through an archaeologist called P.D. Gloop. And what was interesting to me there was that Heaney originally wrote a whole poetics, that is sort of what is a poem, you know, in his optic, but he wrote it not actually on looking at the Danish bog bodies because he hadn't seen them yet, but on the book that Gloop had written on the bog bodies that made them very famous. And I was very interested in that layering, you know. So he writes his poetry on somebody else's, you know, interpretation, and so on and so forth. And then I found that so many others were were also harvesting their material from Gloop's book, and the fact that he was a Danish archaeologist, I thought, this is really interesting. Maybe I should do something more here. So I think both Gloop and Heaney sort of did a lot for the dissemination of the interest in bog bodies, and for Heaney, they also became stand-ins and images of a kind of identity that is national, also for him to see, his own uncle in the face of the Tolland man was a way to also see his own nation, Ireland, and some of the troubles that Ireland went through. So the burning of the bog bodies, the resurrection of the bog bodies came back to tell stories about other types of repression, right? Why are we putting bodies in the bog?
Yeah, and I know that Heaney also talks a little bit about he sees his uncle in the face as well, but also talks maybe a little bit about the identity getting lost in a way, or how we give them pronouns, these bodies. And so I was wondering a little bit, again, coming back to this kind of binary sense of
exactly,
whether we can see the bog bodies as individuals having lived their own life, despite the fact that we interpret them in a certain way, or whether by having them as subjects in a museum and this kind of thing, whether they get delegated to being a subject, and whether they can coexist as both individual and subject. And what you think about that, I guess. Sorry, that's quite a big question, I guess. Oh.
No, I think the really question. Our connection was a little raw here, but I think I caught it, and it's very key to the thinking that I actually had when I was working on it, because I was very interested in the relationship between the body as a thing, something that has become no more human, and the body as being sort of rehumanized through that of giving personal pronouns, he or she, even if at times those pronouns were actually wrong, and that female bodies were actually male, and so on and so forth. It is a way of giving a subjectivity, an identity that then often becomes national, and therefore also often becomes fraught with all kinds of historical, issues. And the question is, why is it that we have that need to put that kind of identity, on? Why do we give them names? Very often the names that we give are located in the names of the place, right? So place names become proper names. So and what happens when we rehumanize those who have actually been, in more cases than not, dehumanized by being sacrificed, for example, to the bog, that is the going theory that many of the bog bodies that have been preserved the way they have were actually human sacrifices from about 2,000 years ago, for fertility reasons, or they could have been placed, which is also a theory, in the bog for transgressions, often of a sexual nature, for example, homosexuality or adultery. So all of those stories, which we have from old sources like Tacitus and also archaeological, so they kind of resurface in the modern interpretations, in the poetry that then has to do about adultery or stuff like that.
So in that way, the sense they... Oh, sorry, Frankie, you go.
No, I was just interested. You said before that they get almost sexualized through being like connected to this sort of wetness of the bog. Maybe you could explain a bit more about that. I'm interested in how that...
Yeah, that was actually a big surprise to me. At a certain point, I was working on a chapter in which I was looking at the uses and misuses of the bodies in terms of sort of politicizing them and ideologies and national identities and these kinds of things. And all these erotic images kept coming up. It was always, bog bodies were often at center when something were happening erotically between, say, an archaeologist and his pupil, typically his pupil, stuff like that. Yeah, to read Edward and us. And then there was the very notion of the bogs themselves as that kind of strange place that couldn't quite, an uncanny place, but also slightly perverse in that it doesn't fit normality. You know, it's not this or that. And I think that that also generates this notion of, well, if it isn't this or that, it's also this liminal space for things to happen that otherwise would not necessarily be within the parameter of institutions, marriage institutions and whatnot. So there was a whole host of poetry and fiction pieces, short stories and novels that I found that were actually using the bogs and the bog bodies as sort of eroticized co-players, if you will, in relationships.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And do you think then this kind of nature of that is why it captured the imagination of so many people to then go on to do poetry and write about it? That it was this kind of place of a lot of nuance, or that it couldn't be put into one box and then they could interpret it in a certain way themselves?
Absolutely. I think that the paradoxical and liminal is always something that seems to ignite the imagination, right? You know, if we know what things are, we tend to sort of, you know, maybe not be quite as imaginary about it. But when things become more unstable and liminal, we want to try to fix it in a sense. We want to try to put some kind of order in place. And part of the sort of key through line of the book that I was working on was to try to show how the bog, because of its nature, and the bog bodies, because of their nature, constantly trouble that you know, pull to want to stabilize and understand and put into sort of dichotomies of, you know, of is it a thing or is it a human, and these kinds of things. And what I propose is it's both, you know, that what they do is that they're constantly, you know, putting us in a zone of discomfort, because, you know, they're uncanny, you know, at the same time they draw us in with their stories. One of the reasons why they do is because we put face on them. We don't just give them personal pronouns, but we also are drawn to the bog bodies that are, so to speak, born or reborn with faces that look like ours, but are not quite like ours. And those who do not have faces simply do not generate the same amount of narrative or poetic imagination. Those who get refaced, that is having their faces reconstructed, all of a sudden, the minute one of those face reconstructions come out, so there's poems and interpretations of all sorts, because all of a sudden we see somebody who looks like your neighbor or looks like your sister, and you start seeing depth there and you start being able to fill it out. So it's very interesting in this notion of, you know, rehumanizing by giving face and pronoun, and also the kind of projections we then make into the faces, because making faces of the past is not something that is just, you know, easy to do without projecting certain things that has to do with maybe race or other things into them. So it can be a very fraught, and it has a very fraught history to do face reconstructions. So I was really interested in sort of looking at that as well. But I think one of the biggest surprises I had was how many fascinating and fabulous pieces of visual art I was able to locate. Lots of artists are interested in the bogs and the bog bodies, probably also because the whole movement of so-called earth art, you know, is could be sort of understood, you know, where you go out and you actually do your piece of art in the landscape itself, and where it's not necessarily supposed to last, but can sort of disintegrate again into. And there were artists that also literally made faces in the bogs, you know, like bog faces that sort of like, that looks back up on us, and so on and so forth. So, and for example, the German artist Josef Beuys, who's one of, you know, the really big names also in earth art, had a performance piece in which he actually sort of went into the bog again, and his signature hat, which he's famous for, was just lying on top. And it was a kind of commentary for him to say, these kinds of liminal spaces are spaces we must preserve. You know, he has sort of an ecological thinking of it as well. These must not be dried out and just be built, you know, into high-rise buildings and whatnot, because of the stories that they can tell, the depth that they have, you know, that tells us about our own history and about ourselves.
And would you say, because now we come up against this topic a lot, that they are being drained a lot, for example, and that they are a lot under threat all over the world, that if we could tap a bit more into that, obviously people know the Tolland Man and things like that, but if we could tap more into this idea of bogs really being this archive of human history and this kind of thing, that we would be drawn more to protect them and to make sure that they aren't being drained and this kind of hold them in time as they are now, that it's something that we should tap more into.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think there is a lot to be said for you know, preserving bog areas that needs to be preserved, and in fact I sort of end the book by going out to the place where the Tolland Man lies with a poem of Seamus Heaney in hand, when he did the same thing, and he was hearing the motorway outside, and I was surprised at the fact that I could hear only very little of the motorway, that there was still this place of magic there, which I hope very much will be preserved. But I'm also really interested in the connection between the sounds of modernity, of the highway, and the bogs, so that we don't just sentimentalize the bog, or we don't just sort of look at it as something that can never be touched, because it is constantly evolving. It's not a fixed place. That's the whole idea here, is that bogs are never just fixed places, right? You know, so we need to somehow engage with that, like you call that, sort of archive of humanity that we also have in there, and modernity. And I think it's in the meeting between the two that I found my fascination really to be. I don't know if you're familiar with the Danish filmmaker Lars von Trier, but it's sort of dogma movies, these kinds of things. But he made an early TV series called The Kingdom, which is the nickname that the Danes have for their major hospital. But it's actually built on bogland, you know. It's, you know, and what he makes just an absolutely wonderful series in which the bog underneath it is constantly, you know, liquefying the solidity of modernity, you know, with all of its instruments and all of its ways to sort of deal with the human body and explaining the human body. And underneath it, we have this sort of bog lying underneath, and of course that will come to haunt and it's just a wonderful image of this meeting between bog and modernity. So I don't want to just throw modernity out. You know, I think we need to engage in how can we think the two together, you know, and how do they inform each other, not just as uncanny things from the past, but also in ways that isn't just sort of nostalgia for preservation.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think at the same time as we're living modernity, we're actually contributing to a future archive as well. You know, that like if people take peat cores now, they find evidence of the radiation from Chernobyl, or they see increased levels of nitrogen, or like our activity is also being recorded right now. So that's again this interesting link in time. Yeah,
I have a new project right now where I'm dealing with ice and ice art, and you know, it sort of came again from this notion of being frozen in time, which is a metaphor, right? Obviously, the bog bodies were never frozen in time, but we think of it as such. And then I sort of took that, and now in my new project, I'm looking at how ice both has this archaeological depth with ice cores, and where you can, you know, investigate the past through ice, and then the ecological disaster that is coming and is already starting, and looking at how artists are then engaging with that temporal concept when you actually sort of take the metaphor frozen in time literal, you know, and sort of say, well, what is actually happening right now? So
when that melts.
a lot of good ice material. If you have any, please send it to me.
Yeah, that sounds cool. Yeah. Well, I do remember seeing one in London, and some guy had brought like a massive chunk of ice and just put it there as his,
Yes.
I guess, in a certain way, performative piece also, you know?
Exactly. And so there's a real connection there. You know, the materiality is different, but the same, and and brings a new kind of imagination to bear.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah. And being in the US, do you find, because I'm aware that most of the bog bodies that I know of are, like, say, the Tolland Man, for example, they're in Germany or Denmark, this kind of thing. Is it also existing in the same way in the US, or it's not really there?
No, there are very few other examples of this than in northern Germany, Holland, England, Ireland, Denmark, some in Sweden, one or two in Norway, and you know, very little else, you know, and some in the Eastern Europe as well. But for all we know, obviously there might be more out there.
That's true. Yeah.
But you need that particular kind of property in the peat to preserve them. And there's probably, I mean, there are many more there. You don't go out and actually dig for them. They're always found accidentally, you know, through peat digging or. And so now when we do no longer dig for peat because you have other sources of heating, very few are found. Yeah. And that's why so many were found right after the Second World War, because you needed to dig for peat again. And so then they would surface.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess there's also, this particular type of peat is occurring more often in Europe. That's why, I guess.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, I guess, also because it maybe reflects a little bit, or, you know, the human sacrifice or the pagan culture tradition, that you really are seeing that in the peat and in the bog, that you're not maybe seeing the similar time period and what was happening in the world then elsewhere. It's interesting.
Nice. I guess we should wrap it up now. I don't know how much.
I haven't received a little notification yet, but it often kind of does it, and then you have this moment of, I think, panic where you realize you're being counted down on. Speaking of time and what time does to us, I guess.
Very true.
I guess you've already, my final question was going to be a little bit about what you're up to now, but I guess you've already told us a little bit about that with the ICE project. But do you have anything else that you want to finish on or anything like that?
No, I want to wish you luck with your conference, and thank you for inviting me. It was fun for me to think back on what I worked on some years back. So time is also running for me.
And do you find, sorry, I now realize I have another question. Do you find, because I read in your book as well that you kind of had read this book and you've mentioned it now early on and then came back to it with Seamus Heaney, this idea. Do you find as well that it continues to sit with you after having written the book, the idea of bog bodies, and coming back to it in your own life? Oh, my connection.
It does, but I worked on this for about 10 years because I have other things to do as well as, you know, in my life at the university. So it took me about 10 years to complete it. And I have to say that when it was completed, I felt like no more bog bodies for me. I needed something else. But the ideas that I was working with, they have stuck with me. This notion of thinking about, you know, the relationship between humans and things. I'm finishing up a book on Hans Christian Andersen right now, actually, that is dealing with this notion that I'm calling Let's Be Human, and it's about his relationship to physical things. But I'm returning to the ice precisely because there was something about the work with the bog bodies that just really resonated with me in terms of trying to understand what time is for us humans, and with the ice, we literally are starting to feel time running out through our fingers. So I am looking at that right now, and hoping to continue some of the thoughts I did in Bodies in the Bog.
Great, we'll have to follow up on it. It's also a very powerful note to finish on, I think, this kind of
Thank you.
Very topical situation. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you.